and furthermore, topics that we will discuss. But I'd like for us to move forward and introduce our speakers. So today, we sadly, Jacqueline Patterson was not able to join us, but she has shared a video recording of her remarks, which I will share very soon. But I'd like to just introduce who she is. Jacqueline Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The mission of the Chisholm Legacy Project is rooted in a just transition framework, serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front lines of climate justice with the resources to actualize visions. Prior to the launch of the Chisholm Legacy Project, Patterson has served as the senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. During her tenure, she founded and implemented a robust portfolio, including serving the state and local leadership, whose constituencies consisted of hundreds of communities on the front lines of environmental injustice. She also led a team in designing and implementing a portfolio to support political education and organizing work executed by NAACP branches, chapters, and state conferences. Since 2007, Patterson has dedicated her career to intersectional approaches to system change. Her passion for social justice led her to serve as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United, senior women's rights policy analyst for Action Aid, assistant vice president of HIV/AIDS programs for IMA, World Health Outreach Project Associate for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, research coordinator for Johns Hopkins University, and U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica. Patterson has also published multiple articles and reports and toolkits, including Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation and Indicators Document, Jobs versus Health, An Unnecessary Dilemma, Climate Change is a Civil Rights Issue, Gulf Oil Drilling Disaster, Gendered Layers of Impact, Disasters, Climate Change Uproot, Women of Color, and the People Shall Lead, Centralizing Frontline Community Leadership in the Movement Towards a Sustainable Planet, and many more. The list goes on of the accomplishments that this woman has made. So sadly, it's sad she won't be joining us, but looking forward to sharing what she has decided to share with us. I'll go on to introducing Dr. Kamala Price, who is a professor and chair of Women's Studies and co-director of the Bread and Roses Center for Feminist Research and Activism at San Diego State University. Her research focuses on reproductive health policy and politics, women of color and the reproductive justice movement, queering reproductive justice, interpretive research methodology, and community-engaged research. She's the author of Reproductive Politics in the United States, and her research has published in journals such as Politics and Gender, Politics, Groups and Identities, Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, Women's Health Issues, Sexuality Research and Social Policy and Context, and in edited volumes such as Homegirls Make Some Noise, a hip-hop feminist anthology, and LGBTQ Politics, a critical reader. She has also written commentary for The Washington Post and The Conversation. She has a PhD in political science and a graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I'll move on to Dr. Adriana Hollis, who leads the National Wildlife Federation's Environmental Justice Team to advance climate justice policy and programs. With more than 20 years of experience in the environmental justice and public health arena, both as a toxicologist and an attorney, Dr. Hollis focuses her work on the intersection of public health, environmental justice, and climate change, on methods for assessing and documenting the health impacts of climate change on communities of color and other traditionally disenfranchised groups. She works to identify priority health concerns related to climate change and other environmental assaults, and evaluate climate and energy policy approaches for their ability to effectively address climate change and benefit underserved communities. And last but not least, I'll introduce Tiana Shaw Wakeman. She is an environmental justice activist who holds a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in social entrepreneurship from the University of Southern California, where she graduated as the first Black university valedictorian in USC's 140 plus year history for the class of 2021. Kudos to you. Currently, Tiana serves as the Environmental Justice Program lead for nonprofit Black Women for Wellness, where she works to advance the health and well-being of Black women and girls by engaging in community-focused research, empowerment, and advocacy. Through her work at BWW, she is actively engaged in efforts to address environmental inequities pushed on communities of color in South LA. Tiana also serves on the board of the Los Angeles League of Conservation Voters to endorse environmental ballot initiatives. This is the only environmental political action committee in Los Angeles County. Tiana's efforts come from a belief that we can all be liberated to live thriving lives free from oppression of white supremacy and capitalism, but only if we prioritize intersectionality, raise the voices of the most harmed, and find solutions and build a better future together. Okay. So now that we have everybody introduced, I'll go into asking you some questions. I have a long list, as I have shared with you all, but we can just have this as a free-flowing discussion and go where it goes. If you all don't mind, I'm just gonna share Dr. Patterson's remarks, just to get that out of the way. Okay. Let's see if I can share. Please let me know if you can hear. One second. Okay. Okay, I see that you guys can't hear, so let me do this another way. I'm sorry, y'all. I just got this video. 1 second.
So we know that this is such an important topic, looking at the intersection of reproductive and environmental justice. We also know that in the past, these kinds of things have been done in ways that are harmful, particularly to Black communities. Can you give us examples of the challenges and recommendations to ensure that these issues of reproductive and environmental health and justice are addressed in the right way and by the right people.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you asked. So, yes, unfortunately, we have seen where, with varying degrees of good intentions and questionable intentions, where people are framing the need to engage around family planning in particular in a way that smacks of population control as a mitigation effort around climate change. We know that often the family planning efforts are directed at Black and Brown people. And we know that population control is often specifically targeted at Black and Brown people. And so besides just the wrongness of that all around, the even the rationale given that that Black folks and people of color in general, BIPOC folks, are least contributing to the proliferation of climate change, and yet it is these populations that are targeted for population control. This is a problem in and of itself. And that often family planning efforts are not only directed towards Black and Brown communities or BIPOC communities in the United States, but also globally. There's a significant investment in family planning in sub-Saharan Africa, and some of it are, really making sure that the women have reproductive choice, which is a critical part of reproductive justice. But the way that it's targeted and the way that it can often be explicitly rationalized around climate mitigation and climate adaptation is where it becomes quite problematic. Anyone who is calling for the need for family planning, for reproductive choice, and so forth, should actually be the people who are desirous of that. It shouldn't be other people who are framing out a rationale for providing it for someone else. And so that is where we have seen a historic challenge around this. And I would definitely recommend an author who has written on this and spoken on this extensively, Jade Sasser, out of University of California, Riverside. If you really want to go deep, she wrote an excellent book around this called On Fertile Ground, I believe, and other publications. So definitely check that out. But I really wanted to make sure that we recognize some of the hazards in this. The environmental programs, environmental organizations that have started family planning efforts. If you care about gender justice, you care about gender justice broadly. You don't kind of target this notion of population control and claim to care about gender justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Getting to that point of the people who are most impacted need to be the people making the decisions. How can community-based organizations and activists address the challenges of the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the context of broader reproductive and environmental justice efforts?
Yes, thank you. So first and foremost,
Sorry, Jackie muted yourself.
Call coming in. No, I did not mute myself. Whenever a call comes in, unfortunately, it mutes automatically. It's very unfortunate, but hopefully that won't happen again. So this is a place, of course, where the communities and women and the challenge around reproductive choice in the context of Roe v. Wade, there are so many intersections here and so many ways that folks can engage around this. One is just directly really addressing reversing that overturning and in terms of the policy itself. Secondly, it is making sure that we are educating our state and local lawmakers, because as they say, all politics are local. And if we have the people who are representing us at the state and local level, understanding what we want and how and exactly what kind of policies we need to support our well-being as communities, as women, as families, then that rolls right up, because we know that, locals then speak to state level representatives. We know that state level representatives, particularly in Congress, are critical to representing us in Washington, D.C. and the federal processes. So we have to make sure that everyone who is in a decision-making position is saturated with what our demands really are around reproductive choice. We know that we have to be very careful about not replicating the challenges around messaging around population in the context of this as it relates to those of us who are climate advocates. But we also recognize that climate justice isn't just about greenhouse gas emissions. Climate justice is about just transition and ensuring that one of the key components of just transition is deep democracy. One of the key components of just transition is caring for the sacred. And what is more sacred than our reproductive, than our choices around bringing new life and ensuring that we can care for and sustain new life, and ensuring that we have what we need in order to be well in our families and in our communities. And so all of this is inextricably interconnected. And so that's the way we need to be talking and framing these matters, not sacrificing the reproductive choice and well-being of our communities for an agenda around climate change in a way that is not our voice speaking in our interests. So just to go back, I would just say to make sure that we are doing all of the political education of our policymakers that really puts forth our demands in our way with our framing is the key. Thank you.
Thank you. You kind of addressed this, but are there specific policy changes or advocacy efforts that you believe can help mitigate these disparities in both reproductive and environmental health outcomes for marginalized communities?
Thank you. Absolutely. For one, I would make sure that we are supporting in whatever policy avenues that are necessary, including ensuring that there's funding available for birthing centers or birth equity centers. And interestingly enough, even though it has the title Birth Equity and Birthing Centers, it's about the wholeness of the reproductive justice continuum. And so having those types of centers, having local centers that are for us, by us, in terms of communities, including the Planned Parenthood clinics and so forth, but ensuring that these avenues are supported so that people have what they need in order to be able to, if they would like to, prevent pregnancies, in order to ensure their reproductive health overall, and to ensure that when we are giving birth, that we're doing so in the most safest, most supported way possible. I know other panelists are speaking about the high rates of maternal mortality in Black communities and so forth, and we know that for sure when birthing centers are present, when local centers are present, when women are supported, then we have a much, much higher likelihood of both delivering healthy babies to term and of surviving that delivery. As an example, we also know that when we have the tools that we need to keep ourselves safe, whether it's from sexually transmitted diseases or from pregnancy, making sure that we're pregnant when we want to be pregnant, and otherwise, we know that that is healthier, more sustainable for ourselves, for our families, for our communities. And we also know that this is inextricably tied to policies around clean air, clean water, because when those toxins get into our bodies, it can both prevent us from being able to give birth in the way that we want. It can harm our children when they're in utero and afterwards. So we also see all of this as being inextricably, again, interconnected. So whether it's policies around regulating for clean air, clean water, policies around ensuring that we have resources for clean production of goods locally, clean production of energy, so that we don't have to have regulations around clean air, clean water, because we're producing in a way that doesn't even produce those toxins in the first place. and ensuring that we have centers that are equipped to provide everything that we need for our reproductive health continuum, reproductive choice continuum, reproductive justice continuum. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I am going to pause recording.
And thank you for having me.
Okay. So we know that this is such an important topic, looking at the intersection of.
Okay. Well, that was a great way for us to find a natural place to continue this conversation and not waste any time. And that what I noticed, everyone was nodding their heads and everyone was in consensus of everything she was saying. But it was pretty clear that there is a nuance to reproductive justice as it relates to Black women and women of color, especially in the United States or globally in the global South. And so we should be cognizant of that when we're thinking of what challenges there may be regarding this Roe v. Wade overruling. So I just want to see if any of you have anything more to add or experiences unique to what your work is that speak to that, and whatever you'd like to add to those type of questions. Whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Pretty much what she said is, spot on in terms of thinking about the connections between reproductive justice and environmental justice. And this is something that the reproductive justice has been trying to do for a long time, because part of it, and again, reproductive justice is a framework that was created by Black women, right? It was for women of color, by women of color. To sort of capture the experiences, the reproductive experiences of women of color that was sort of missing from the mainstream movement. So it's kind of want to put that out there. But one of the things that they've always talked about is that you can't look at reproduction in a vacuum, that it is connected to all these issues: environmental justice, economic justice, mass incarceration. I mean, the list goes on, and that we can't truly sort of achieve reproductive liberation until we also work on these other issues, which is why, in terms of the reproductive justice movement, it's important to work in coalition, not sort of within the movement, but also in coalition across movements, working with the environmental justice groups, working with civil rights groups, working with groups that work on immigration and so on, because it's going to take a lot to kind of dismantle all the issues that we've been dealing with. But to also add, in terms of thinking about race and class, when you're talking about reproductive justice and environmental justice and so on, is that, we have to think about is not only the pregnancy related complications that come along with this, but also with, Black children who are being born, and also indigenous children, because they're the most likely to die within the first years of their life, right? Because we have high infant mortality rates. They're the ones that are the most likely to be born preterm, the most likely to be born with low birth rate or extreme low birth rate. So there's a lot that's going on, and there's a lot to unpack. But also in terms of thinking about these statistics, particularly when we talk about maternal mortality, pregnancy-related deaths, and whatnot, it cuts across socioeconomic class, because the first thing people say, oh, maybe it's because we're talking about low-income women, whatever. But you have people like Serena Williams, who almost died giving birth. And she's probably one of the richest people on this planet, right? With, access to all kinds of good care or whatever. But a lot of it has to do with systemic racism, structural racism, the implicit biases of healthcare workers. I mean, there are issues like there are certain complications that, Black folks in general have, like hypertension, diabetes, whatever, that can contribute to these things. But also, we're talking about healthcare professionals who aren't trained to deal with communities of color, and they come with their own assumptions and biases, particularly when it comes to Black women. If a Black woman who is, or a Black person who's birthing, sort of complains or says that they're in pain or there's something wrong, they're usually dismissed, right? it's usually because they're thinking, oh, you're just being overly dramatic, or they might think, oh, she's trying to get drugs in the process, or we still have healthcare officials who think Black women have a higher threshold of pain, and so they're kind of are reluctant to kind of regulate, do pain regulation during childbirth and things like that. We also have to realize that communities of color tend to live in what we call contraceptive deserts, family planning deserts. They're not located, they don't have sort of access to healthcare services when it comes to like contraception and things like that that they need, or just having regular wellness checks. That's an issue still. And with Roe v. Wade, this is going to be make it even worse. So that, because many people weren't living in counties that or parishes that have abortion providers. This is going to make it even worse. And what's going to happen, and what's happening, what we're finding is they're having to travel if they have the means to out of state. In the state of California, we're seeing an increase of people coming from other states coming in to seek abortions. And things like that. So those were kind of the first things that came to mind when I was listening to what Jackie had to say. But I think I'll stop here if other people want to kind of chime in.
I'll share. Just to give a little bit of background, Black Women for Wellness is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based in Leimert Park, California, and we've been around since 1997 with the purpose of uplifting the health and well-being of Black women and girls. We are a reproductive justice human rights organization. And a question that I get asked often, and something that I spend a lot of time explaining and talking about joyfully, actually, to build these connections, is why is there an EJ team at a reproductive justice organization? Why does our reproductive justice organization have food programs, voting programs? Why are we talking about water? Why are we talking about plastic? And I think it goes back to what Dr. Price said about you can't look at reproductive justice in a vacuum. And for me, I think it is always helpful to go back to the framework, to go back to the tenets. All people have a right to have a child, the right to not have a child. And then the third and fourth tenets, I think, very clearly tie in environmental justice principles around the third tenet being that everyone should have the right to raise a family if they so choose in healthy and safe conditions, regardless of race, income, national status, etc. And then the last, the right to bodily autonomy. So the tenets, I think, are foundational in terms of the connections between EJ and RJ, but then also the foundings of both. Dr. Price also mentioned how reproductive justice was founded, and environmental justice. The people consider the founding of environmental justice in the U.S. to be North Carolina, when Black folks were protesting a dumping of PCBs, which are carcinogenic chemicals, in their communities. So the foundings of both were also Black people feeling like these traditional movements of conservation, white feminism, weren't really getting towards the needs of Black folks, especially in the South, I'll say, as a Southerner myself. Then we also know that uplifting reproductive justice uplifts EJ and back and forth. And then environmental racism distinctly affects reproductive health, and then both are also rooted in human rights. In terms of environmental factors affecting health, I kind of think about it in two buckets. One bucket, I think, are the ways in which the bad things harm health. So and the other is kind of the ways in which good things in your environment can promote health and well-being. So for the first bucket, there can be huge toxic exposure in both the built environments people live, play, pray, and work in every day. And then this can come from a facility in Los Angeles. This might be an active oil site. It can come from poor or old infrastructure like lead pipes. It can come from living in an area that's concentrated with highways and has a lot of air pollution, or being in an area that gets hotter due to the heat island effect. And the list goes on, unfortunately. Then there's the personal care, products, cosmetics, beauty industry side of things, which Black Women Wellness works a lot on. And this is the reality that Black women, based on national biomonitoring data, have higher levels of beauty product related chemicals inside their bodies. And this comes from overmarketing, overexposure of toxic chemicals and personal care products, which is a result of the same kind of systemic racism that has led to our built environments being so racist in the way that they are laid out, and in the way that Black folks versus other demographics experience environmental harm. And the same is true in the beauty industry. So all of this harm coming from all sides can be cumulative, and a lot of it has direct harms on reproductive health. For instance, we do a lot of work around eliminating oil drilling in LA. And there's been research from Stanford and Berkeley that birthing people living near active oil and gas drilling can be at an increased risk of experiencing preterm birth or having lower birth weight babies. And then on the personal care side of things, many of the chemicals that can be found are what we call endocrine disrupting chemicals, or chemicals that can harm your hormonal system and can be linked to ovarian cancer, breast cancer, uterine cancer. So the harm is real on all fronts. And then from the other bucket, there are the good things: having more access to green space, reducing stress, having access to clean water, which can help people thrive. And we think of this as really tying into the reproductive justice tenets. And I think those are some of the connections that we draw. And then I think it's also important to note that reproduction and harm to Black bodies have been connected for centuries. I mean, slave owners wanted female enslaved peoples to be fertile because that meant more labor and more money, more property. Then when Black people were freed, at least from literal chains, the exact opposite happens. Eugenic efforts aim to reduce the Black population, like forced sterilization and experimentation. So when we talk about historical and present harm to Black bodies, wealth in this country and white supremacy in this country are both intrinsically tied to controlling the reproduction of Black women. So now with the Dobbs decision, we see a lot of that never left in certain counties and in certain places, but we also see that similar, when we tie things back even further, that the decision about whether or not a state bans or protects abortion is now a states' rights issue rather than one of the federal government, which is a wrong decision. And I think it's helpful to say states' rights because a lot of us probably just thought about the Confederacy. So white supremacists using states' rights as a cover for hate and control is not at all new. And yeah, so I'll stop there, but just some of the things that also came to mind as I was hearing the professor speak. Thank you.
And thank you. So I'll just be brief. I wanted to, I guess, sort of cement the thinking in the work that we do around environmental justice, which is, of course, your environment being where you live, play, pray, work, go to school, and all of that. And so when we think about Black people generally and women specifically who are already experiencing harms from environmental contamination because of structural racism and redlining and NIMBY, not in my backyard, and activities like that, we know that it's exacerbated by climate change, and that women and susceptible populations, women, young girls, trans people, non-binary, non-gender conforming, or gender non-conforming people are most at risk. So we, in the work that I do around EJ and the policies that I look at in making connections between all of these things sort of stem from the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Public Organization. And also a week later, the court decided to make, as Tiana said it, a wrong decision this time in West Virginia versus EPA, right? Which pretty much took the power away from EPA when it came to controlling greenhouse gas release from power plants. So we know that climate change exacerbates environmental contamination. We know that people of color and low income are most at risk because of structural and social racism. We know this. And we know that when it comes to issues around climate change, people find themselves in situations where they have to evacuate in times of severe weather. They have to, they choose to migrate. They have to migrate in a lot of instances to save their lives. During those and other episodes, women and others are most at risk from sexual assault. And it's the same thing we see when we see severe weather or severe events like with COVID. That was an opportunity for opportunity in a negative way, that where we saw increases in domestic violence and sexual assault and other assault against those who are considered to be less protected or less able to protect themselves. And so that's kind of the way I look at it. So I feel that the people who, I'm going to say men, but the people who made a decision, the wrong decision in Roe v. Wade, in Dobbs, didn't look at the ramifications of that. and the interconnectedness of that. Because had they done so, and had they seen the far-reaching effects of that, when it comes to populations that are already at risk, or maybe that was maybe that was the intent. I don't know. As Jackie said about controlling with eugenics, things like that. But I think that with EJ, which is my focal area, I don't think people considered the long-term effects of that. We saw right after the decision, people who were sadly carrying babies that had expired in utero, but they could not get an abortion. They hadn't considered that either. So, for us to expect them to think logically farther ahead, I think is something that we're expecting too much. And so I think the ramifications of Roe v. Wade when it comes to reproductive justice issues and environmental justice are so intrinsic and so entrenched in each other that one would think that maybe only those who work in this space can automatically think about, oh, what is this going to do about this? How is this going to affect this? But I feel like it's I wouldn't be surprised if there is a push to rethink it, but not just because it's wrong on its face, but also because of the long-term ramifications that we and others are putting together. So, so to all that to say that Roe v. Wade has so many, long-term connections, or it affects so many parts of our lives. And yeah, the majority of it is women and children and young girls and all of that it hasn't even been identified. Everything hasn't even been identified yet. And we can talk about it as we go along, but I think that we're going to be finding more things as we go.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on this, I actually had a panel not that long ago where people seem to be optimistic, and I'm like, you are, because they thought, oh, well, they'll never touch birth control. What I was like, did you actually read the opinion, and particularly Clarence Thomas's opinion, right? That I like, if you didn't know it now, then before now, I mean, they're basically using Roe v. Wade as a sort of the stepping stone to look at other issues, because in his opinion, he basically wrote, "Oh, now that we've overturned Roe v. Wade, and and the reasoning behind it is flawed. Now we can go after contraception. Now we can go after sodomy laws. Now we can go after same-sex marriage." And I'm like, actually, you can just add to the list: civil rights, voting rights. I mean, you just list the names. Everything that we've made some progress in, I think that Roe v. Wade decision is emboldening people to kind of look at all of those policies. And I don't think people actually understand how far reaching that decision can actually be, and how far that it can actually go. And so that's why I am nervous to see what's going to come next in terms of what will be the next thing. And I always tell people, and notice when he wrote that list, he did not include Loving v. Virginia, interracial marriages. Just put that out there, sort of the self-serving part of it, right?
That's right. And can I just quickly say, with EJ, we talk about equal protection under the law, right? And the fact that everyone has the right to clean air, to food, to healthy food, we say all of these things because they're true. We all deserve the same rights. And so when we think about the premise behind environmental justice, it's the same premise, right? We all have the right to do what's best for ourselves. That's really what it all says. And that includes the right to, when it comes to reproduction or contraception or anything like that, right? And so that I agree with you, Dr. Price, that this is so far reaching, and we can delve into it, but I wish that those who had come up with this ridiculous idea had delved into, and then what might happen, and instead of, and then what else can we get our hands on, and I love your point about loving that didn't come up. Very good point.
Okay, thank you very much for this continuation of the conversation. And what I what I get from this is that it's very essential for us to consider the cumulative effects of not just environmental, but also social, that that are impacting and limiting the access to reproductive services, and also just the general health of families generationally. And so I know you guys were starting to envision what are the possible impacts generationally, and maybe we don't want to think about it, or I don't know what approach we like to think, if we want to be preventative or be hopeful or whatever it may be. But in the general I guess world of reproductive justice movements and environmental justice movements, do you think that what they present to be the pressing priorities after this ruling are really addressing these issues that are nuanced and specific for women of color, BIPOC women, or birthing people?
Can you repeat that?
Sorry, was it confusing? Sorry. So you have all stated what are potentially like pressing priorities that we should be considering as we move forward in the reproductive justice and environmental justice movement. But do you think that the general reproductive justice, or the mainstream reproductive justice and environmental justice movement are addressing all of these cumulative impacts or potential stressors?
So I can jump in. So that question is a yes and no, right? After Hurricane Katrina, people learned that, well, a lot of us learned, and I heard firsthand from people, that they were turned away because they happened to be gender nonconforming, turned away from shelters in New Orleans, right? And and with emergency evacuation, there's always the issue around access to health care as you've been evacuated. People don't have, they may not have information with them, because who knew to grab their health card, when they didn't plan on evacuating, until they had no choice, right? They probably would grab their family member first, or their child, or something like that, right? So but because of Hurricane Katrina and others, people are learning these lessons and focusing. Some people are focusing on that. Do I think that it has gotten the focus that it needs? Absolutely not. But I think that, because I don't limit the view to reproductive justice and environmental justice. There's climate justice, because, as I mentioned earlier, about that whole interaction and how that exacerbates existing conditions. There's economic justice, there's healthcare, there are all of these issues. So I think that organizations are bringing attention, much needed attention, to these issues, and the lack of focus and preparation when it comes to situations where people traditionally don't have access, and even more so in situations that are out of their control, that may be climate based, or maybe if we talk about places like Houston, where there are containers for hazardous substances that are empty, but when it rains and storms, water gets inside and it rinses these contaminants out, and they get into the groundwater, and people have food in raised beds or whatever, and now they're ingesting chemicals that may be hazardous to their, that are hazardous to their health. But nobody's thinking about all of those things, or nobody has been thinking about them. Now I think that as we raise our voices and talk about cumulative exposure, and even as this administration is talking about cumulative exposure, that's the beginning. Now we need to delve into what that means, because it involves so many different things. And that's just my perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll share to piggyback off of that in your question. What comes to mind is Maya Angelou's quote, "The truth is, no one of us can be free until everybody is free." And so I think when it comes to EJRJ, so much of this work is about working with, for, because of the people most harmed, the people most impacted, which are people of color. And when I hear like in the bigger environmental movements or bigger kind of feminist movements outside of reproductive justice, environmental justice spaces, I think many groups are very comfortable leaving people behind. And I think this is true in some climate policy that has been passed. This is true in certain regulation that says that there might be an allowable or acceptable risk of harm from X facility, a permit to pollute, usually in communities of color. This is true because of what was just mentioned around cumulative exposure, that now we're beginning to actually think about cumulative exposure, even though this has been something that RJ advocates, EJ advocates have been saying and screaming to the rooftops for a very long time. And then as it relates to the Dobbs decision, even though it is true that some states have worked to further enshrine the right to abortion access. I live in California. We did that this last year, and my organization has been working on a lot of policy to make abortion even more accessible, including getting rid of co-payments and to decriminalize pregnancy loss, and a lot of great policies. At the same time, none of us is free until all of us are. So if we only think about what's happening in our own states and not what's happening in our brother and sister states, then we're not going to succeed. We're not going to make sure that all of us are coming through and are liberated together. And I think about Georgia, not my home state, but I'm from all over the South and I have family in Georgia. There are over 150 counties in Georgia, and I believe 82 of them don't have any access to OB/GYN care. 15 of them, I think, have one provider. And this data was as of 2020, before the Dobbs decision. So a lot of the statistics and data and the realities of what it is to be a Black person living with extreme environmental harm, a Black person living in a community that does not have access to healthcare, does not have access to quality food, does not have these accesses, was true before the Dobbs decision, and now there's even more to overcome. So I think that to be humble, I think I'm always thinking about the ways that I can better actualize all of these connections through my work and better educate about them and create better policy. And I think I really do always go back to, no one can get left behind. We're not doing our jobs. I'm not doing my job if anybody is getting left behind. And that's something that I will hold true as long as I can.
Yeah, so I just want to add a couple of things. I just want to put on people's radars. The states that had the trigger abortion bans are basically states that have like the highest percentages of Black folks. So let's keep that in mind. This is why, people ask like, how is it going to disproportionately affect women of color? Well, if you're living in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, they have large populations of Black folks. Those are in there, and if they're are in need of an abortion, they're going to have to think, oh, what they're going to do, like going whatever state or what have you. But in terms of like the mainstream movement, I'm assuming you mean like the Planned Parenthoods, the NARALs of the world. As someone who's worked in that world for a while and actually have served on the local Planned Parenthood board, it's really interesting, sort of the differences between like, because I go between worlds, like between like Sister Song and whatever. And like in the mainstream sort of organizations, you sort of see this, they have adopted some of their RJ language and so forth, and, tried to incorporate those principles with varying degrees. And I can sort of speak in terms of my experiences sort of serving on the board of the local Planned Parenthood here, which is actually the second largest Planned Parenthood in the whole federation. And I think it tends to be better than some of the other Planned Parenthoods in terms of incorporating reproductive justice, because staff wise, there are a lot of people of color who work for Planned Parenthood and in those communities and made an effort to incorporate RJ in their work. But it was always a challenge dealing with the other board members, because a lot of our board members came sort of with that sort of mainstream movement ideas of choice and what have you, and just only focusing like on abortion and not understanding the connections. And I can't tell you how many discussions I've had where trying to push the board to sign on to certain things, like having to explain and like backing up our staff members who were making the argument why we need to sign on to to push for the city council to raise the minimum wage. And like, well, the people that we serve, they work minimum wage jobs. Is that, I would think that would be in our interest to push for that. Um, or when, number 45 was in office and he did the Muslim ban, why, we made a point of why we needed to push back against this. Again, if you're thinking about the communities that we serve, a lot of our folks are Muslim. So I always have to constantly make those arguments of why, as a reproductive health organization, we should politically be involved in certain things, and sort of making the connections, because they're like, what does that have to do with reproductive health? It's like, well, it has a lot to do with it if you think about the people that we serve. And so I think there is still some work to be done. And I think they're trying to get it, but they don't always fully get it. But I think that's why we need to keep having forums like this and sort of pushing people to understand it's not just about abortion and contraception. There's so much else going on in the connections, and like in the connections in terms of food security, in terms of the climate. That's very important for us to address. And also, as someone from Louisiana, I am intimate knowledge of, well, I shouldn't say intimate knowledge of Cancer Alley. I grew up an hour outside of New Orleans. And so sort of understand that predicament, and actually know what it's like to actually drive along the River Road, that the portion between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where it's this chemical plant after chemical plant. You can tell something's not right. It smells. At night, there's an orange glow. And then we always like, I don't understand how people can live here. But then you realize they have nowhere else to go. How are they going to sell their homes? No one's going to buy a home in an area that is contaminated by chemicals, right? And also, I know from my family members, I wasn't living in Louisiana at the time, but Katrina. And I know the impact Katrina had on, people there in my family and so forth. And I know what it's like to go through a major hurricane, because the last major hurricane I went through was Andrew, which was a huge one back in the early 90s. So for me, there is kind of a personal connection to this as well.
And I am so glad that at least, I don't know, Bling, where you're from, but that I'm from Mobile. So just having that connection, because as we know, the South is the least, has been getting the least attention, particularly when it comes to this. I did some work in Gaston County, Florida, and the maternal mortality rate was through the roof, as well as the fact that so many infants, babies, didn't live past the first year. And of course, Gaston County is pretty much contaminated. A lot of it, the areas that people of color live in. And it's just an example. I live close to Africa Town, which is another area that is contaminated. So there is, all of this goes back to the right, the right to be healthy, and the right to healthcare, and the right to live, to live as we see fit.
Yes,
Dr.
Right, and it shouldn't be commonplace that people have pregnancy complications. When someone who's going through an issue with their pregnancy, and people's like, well, I know so and so who went through this too. That should not be the norm. That should not be the norm.
Yes, most definitely. I will say I'm from Los Angeles, like Tiana, and feeling so, a little like ignorant, and also like maybe fearful. Like I migrated from Los Angeles for my master's to New York, to another very liberal city and state, and then now to Maryland. And it's, I become more cognizant of like, let me look and make sure the laws and the state of the services that are accessible are going to be able to support me, and what I have to be prepared for is something more and more cognizant for me, the more like south I might be going. And so I just, piggybacking off of what Tiana said, and not leaving anyone behind. It can be, it seems like it's difficult, especially in states in the South where, they might feel alone and not close to any states that may be able to lend a hand to help. So as you say, what are some success stories that you may have heard of in these states that are highly impacted by this overruling, where communities have been able to help each other get through this and get through the struggles, and also maybe on a more national lens, how have states been able to lend a hand to others that have less access and restrictive laws?
If you're asking specifically for the South, I'm not quite sure what can I say. Because I've actually had an interesting conversation with someone, a colleague of mine, that we both realized that we're both from Louisiana. He's from New Orleans, and I'm from a town that's called Thibodeau, that's about an hour away. And he had worked, with environmental justice groups for a while, and sort of left out of frustration. And still to this day, of like, because the state itself, the officials, they don't seem to really care. They're very slow to react, and because it is low income people of color, I don't really think it's a priority for them. And it's kind of like, well, you decided to live there, just move. And the thing is, though, you can't just move, right? And I think I've heard some talk that the state might be sort of giving people money so they can, so they are able to move. But I'm not sure all the details about that. I'm not even sure if that's completely true or not. But I do know, like in the state of California, for example, Forward Together, which is a group that's in Oakland, and so like in the 2000s, they worked with nail salon workers, Asian American nail salon workers, to pass a bill that was the Safe Cosmetics bill, which basically says, they have to disclose the chemicals that they use in their products, or any chemicals that can cause reproductive health harm. So I hear things like that, like in California. In terms of Louisiana, and I know people have been active since the 80s, when I was a teenager. But in terms of triumphs, I'm not quite sure. But you just keep moving forward, right? Until you can get a point where you make some headway. But if you started, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll share. I'm from the South. My family's from Charleston. I moved to Los Angeles for school, so I love the Southern panel of women. But I think for me, growing up, I would say my mom's a nurse, my sister's a nurse, so a lot of our health always was very communal and very within my family, and so I imagine that is true in other circumstances as well. But I think as it relates to kind of efforts, some successful efforts, as well as like some threats to those efforts, related to what Dr. Price just mentioned. So a lot of organizations, as it relates on the personal care product side of the environmental justice work and toxins and personal care products, had been working for a long time and are still working to try to get the FDA to have stronger powers as it relates to cosmetics. And this is another connection between how things that are pushing to seemingly solely affect reproductive justice will affect other elements as well, because if they're all connected. Well, a bill passed, Biden signed in December, called MOCRA, which is the Modernization of Cosmetics, I think, Regulation Act. And this was the first piece of cosmetics regulation to be signed into law since in over 80 years. And it's significant because in the US, regulation around chemicals, products that can be used and sold is extremely limited. For instance, the EU bans or regulates over 2,000 different ingredients, and for the US, it's about 11. And there are over 10,000 different kinds of chemicals used in personal care products. But one of the things that was a success was that this law gave the FDA authority to recall cosmetics products which show harm. And that it was significant because we know that the FDA has that authority for food, but did not previously for cosmetics. And there's other good things as well. But again, as it relates to RJ, EJ, and kind of different efforts that are taking place, I'm sure many on this call have been following the current debate around mifepristone, which is one of 2 drugs used for medical abortion. So a Texas federal judge ruled with those suing a group of anti-abortion orgs that access to mifepristone should be paused during their court case. And the case is basically these groups saying the FDA should not have granted approval for Miffy, despite tons of research and science saying it's perfectly safe, in 2000, and that they never should have allowed telehealth approval. So the judge this case is up through is a known anti-abortion conservative judge, so it's very politicized. And as of now, the drug is still available in the states it was before this ruling, because the Supreme Court granted an appeal by the Justice Department. But if for some reason Miffy is restricted by the courts, this could affect people in all states, regardless of that state's stance on abortion access. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because one of the things that they're challenging in this legal debate is whether or not the FDA did its job correctly. So as we have advocates pushing for the FDA to better protect people from toxins in personal care products that are really harming reproductive health, there are cases going on that arguing that could hurt both abortion access, taking away one of the important drugs for medical abortions, and it could also hurt the FDA's authority in general. So I think the positives is that there are so many efforts taking place to make federal regulation, whether it's through the EPA or through the FDA, stronger. And we wrote at the same time, and this was mentioned earlier, these Supreme Court cases and all of these lawsuits that are coming are at the same time stripping powers or trying to strip powers from these agencies that are needed to protect people across the country, regardless of like that state specific laws. So I think with that, it is interesting to like chart all of these different things happening, and it's particularly interesting to see how the courts are being kind of used as so politicized, and how even at the recent slate of Supreme Court cases this past summer, how much research came out and how many panels I went through to learn about why it's so insane that some of these cases are even getting taken in the first place, and how people are using the courts to specifically angle cases to get to the Supreme Court to overturn things that people don't want, dislike. And I think that's something that all of us can be aware of. And as we're being aware of it, can be allies, especially to people in states where those laws can have a stronger effect.
And also, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was known that she didn't really particularly care how Roe v. Wade was decided, and had always said that we needed to codify abortion and reproductive rights into law. And I think that's what we need to do, to ensure that everyone across the nation has access to reproductive health care services, and not rely on going state to state. Because as we know, there are going to be certain states, they're always going to be anti-abortion. They're also going to be anti-queer, anti-trans, the whole thing, right? And so there are some things where, we have to say maybe these have to rise to the federal level, and they can't go to the states, because we see what happens, right? And again, it's also important why we need to follow politics. It's important who we elect into office, because we have all these conservative judges sitting on the bench now because 45 nominated them, and a Republican Senate pushed them, voted them into office. And so we have to think about all these other different things. And I know a lot of us can be disengaged with politics because it doesn't speak to us, they're messy, whatever, right? But it is important because we end up in the place that we are right now. And I always have to remind people, this wasn't something that happened overnight. They started doing this in the 80s. And this is the culmination of all that work that they did over the last 4 decades.
Dr. Alice, if you have any final additions, if not, I'm gonna open it for questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat or comments. But in the meantime, if there's any final remarks you'd like to share, please go ahead. Okay.
other than encourage people to get involved in the communities, get involved in the organizations, and vote, or even run for office. I mean, that's one of the things my students came from, because I was teaching my reproductive rights and justice class while the Supreme Court was still deliberating Dobbs. And, you know, there was a pall that was sort of this dark cloud that was hanging over our class throughout that semester. And I think that's when my students, you know, they're like, we need to be more involved. And I actually had a few of them said, maybe I need to run for office. I'm like, maybe you should. And maybe that's where we, you know, maybe this is part of the wake up call that we needed, to realize that we can't take our rights for granted.
And I'm just going to add to that the thought behind cumulative exposure, and we need to be expanding that to include cumulative exposure pathways, right? Because of the ramifications of that, you know, and not just, you know, in terms of you ingest, not ingest, you are exposed to some particular chemical and the actions that it, and I'm just saying it, I'm trying not to be too much of a toxicologist. The interaction it has with your body can manifest in so many different ways, in ways that we haven't even noted. And I think part of that information is going to come from community, Dr. Price. So I'm definitely a believer in getting involved in hearing the voices of communities, of those who normally aren't given an opportunity to have a voice. You know, they have a lot of information to give us. We can get, you know, in a community that I worked in, people didn't know, the government didn't know why people were exposed, why the population, it was a minority population, why babies were dying, why there was so much maternal, such a high maternal mortality. And then it was, oh, well, yeah, this field is also contaminated. It used to be used as a cattle vat dipping station where they would walk the cattle through and let them walk around dripping pesticides. But that was historic knowledge. It wasn't in the books. And so I think the importance of interacting and providing opportunity and storytelling and or truth telling, as I call it, it's going to help us map out this phenomena of things that affect. There could be a heading: things that affect reproductive health, or things that affect us as people, things that affect us as, you know, those who are not protected, not a protected group. So I do want to, you know, to ask us all to be more open-minded and think about the possibility of connections.
Yeah, and similarly to that, I think as I've been organizing, working with community members, and why I always say that we do community-focused, community-based research, empowerment, advocacy, because we really do. That is our focus, and that is what makes the work work. But I also know that while I do doing this work, I know that not everyone has a natural connection to the words environmental justice or reproductive justice or reproductive health, reproductive rights, environmental health. But I think most of us do have an intimate connection to civil rights, to human rights. And when we hear that, we know what that means. And I think that alone, and everything that we've talked about today is under that umbrella of civil rights, of things that we as human beings on this earth deserve, but are not currently getting because of systemic inequity, because of systemic racism. And I think that as we all are going into the world and doing our work, people impacted have the answers, especially when we talk about civil rights, especially when we like lean into the issues that people are facing on the ground and the issues that each of us have faced in our personal lives that maybe brought us to this work in the first place. And I think so much of our work across, it can feel pigeonholed sometimes doing this policy or putting out this fire, or that fire, because there's always a lot of fires. But across the social justice sphere, so much of our work is connected. And a lot of that connection comes from some very similar root problems like redlining, urban planning, and land use in these decisions. So as we tease out those connections where we can all have a unified front to make sure that we're pushing these policies together across issue areas, then the more progress I think we make together. And that's something that I think I've seen in a lot of the policies or a lot of the pushes that are happening right now post the jobs decision. And it's something that I'm really hopeful for, really leading to that like mass liberation that we're all working towards.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Dr. Price, Dr. Alice, and Tiana. It was great to hear your perspectives, and I hope everyone who attended enjoyed. I certainly did. But hope you'll have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Nice
you.
meeting you.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.